Hey guys, tell me, what country is this image from? It was Somalia, but look at these two images. This is Germany after World War II, and this is Somalia during 2006, during its still ongoing civil war. But this could also be neighboring Kibera, Kenya. But hold on, how could these two be the same city? But this could also be Vantan, Johannesburg, Los Angeles, Toronto, Hong Kong, San Francisco, Mumbai, Lagos, Panama, Rio de Janeiro, and even New York. So let's go back to Somalia and another country on the quiz, the USSR. But why these two countries? It's not because of their present, but it's because of their past, both being communist countries, with both of them being destroyed by it. Not really, one bounced back and the other is a failed state. So let's get to both of these nations' histories and how nationalism and communism affected their nations. But first, what exactly is communism? Is it an ideology, an ideal? We'll need to get to that first. Communism is an ideology where there is no private property, and everything is the collective property of the people and is state controlled. Now that we've gotten the basics out the way, let's get to it. So where do we start our story? Over here around the late 1980s. But what if I said I was lying? To explain how communism started in these two countries, we need to explain how it got there in the first place. So we have to start our story during World War I, when Russia just surrendered to Germany in the First World War and fell into a civil war with two sides fighting, the Bolsheviks and the Provisional Government. Basically, these guys were communists and these guys wanted a republic. The communists ended up winning the civil war and Joseph Stalin became the leader of the new Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in 1889, the Horn of Africa, Italy and Britain were fighting over modern-day Somalia and ended up carving it into two pieces, British Somaliland in the north and Italian Somaliland in the south. After World War I, Britain gifted Italy Jubaland for participating in World War I. Nothing was really happening in this region until 1935, when Italy declared war on Ethiopia for a second time. Yes, a second time. Italy suffered a humiliating defeat to Ethiopia 40 years prior. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were getting quite heated. Germany wouldn't stop expanding and everybody started getting mad because Germany wouldn't stop and they started a world war with each other. Long story short, Germany betrayed the USSR and got railed. And that also meant that Italy lost their colonies in East Africa. Since they were on the German side, with Eritrea being given to Ethiopia and Italy having a temporary trusteeship in Somalia, in the promise of Somalia gaining independence in 10 years. So back to Europe. After World War II, the USSR and the USA stopped being buddies because of their ideological differences, capitalism and communism. And they split Europe in half, forming an Iron Curtain, causing a Cold War. And it was no way cold. The world started dividing itself into First World, Second World, and Third World. And these have nothing to do with how developed these nations are. Unlike the terms they are used for today, these divisions run deeply and split countries in half. Vietnam, Korea, China, Yemen, and then one of the two countries which the video is actually about, Somalia. So let's skip to 1960. Somalia gained its independence and Somaliland merged with Somalia to create the Somali Republic. But hold on before we continue. These are two things we need to mention, and that is demographics. And this is a major reason of these two nations collapsing. So let's get to the numbers. First, the USSR. The dominant majority in the superpower is Russians, at about half the population, with the Ukrainians at 15%, Uzbeks at about 6%, then Belarusians at 3.5%, followed with Kazakhs, Azeris, and those are only the ones with about 2% or more of the population. Don't forget, this isn't mentioning the dozens of ethnicities the Soviet Union had. So big country, diverse population. So what about down to the equator in Somalia? Well, it's the most homogeneous country in Africa, also having the longest coastline in Africa. And you might be wondering, how was Somalia's collapse even possible when everybody's Somali? Everyone speaks Somali and everyone participates in Islam. So this country can't fail, right? Well, no. Every single country has a division or they just blame their neighbors. So Somalia has internal divisions called clans. So to put it shortly, everyone can track their lineage to a common ancestor. And these clans are really important, with their modern day parliament following a 4.5 clan system, with the 4 major clans of the country and 0.5 I don't really know. Just in case, Somalia just gained its independence and they had Aden Ade as their leader, with the Somali Youth League as the ruling party of Somalia for about 7 years. After Aden Ade conceded power to Abdi Rashid Ali Sharmake, after losing to him in an election in 1967, making history as the first African leader to concede power peacefully in a democratic election, excluding Liberia that is. 2 years later, later, Sharmaka would be assassinated by one of his bodyguards, and not long after, it would be followed by a coup d'etat, and the pro-communist Siad Barre would come to power. So, to the Soviet Union, World War II ending, Europe split in half, so what did Stalin do? Well, he placed communist governments all around Eastern Europe and spread the ideology of the state controlled everything. Oh yeah, and the USSR started making nuclear weapons, which made Western nations quite uncomfortable, and the relationship started to crumble, with the Western nations intervening in the USSR's backyard by inviting Greece and Turkey to NATO in the fear of communism spreading, effectively making the USSR stuck in a pond. But you might be wondering, how does this make any sense? The USSR has a massive coastline, says you, dear viewer. Well, climate. The USSR's land area is mostly subarctic, and this includes most of its coastline, being also tundra, meaning that its coastline is mostly frozen all year, and innavigable for trade and making it lackluster for any economic activity, apart from the few settlements in mineral hotspots in Siberia. So the USSR's only viable ports and coastlines are Vladivostok, the Black Sea, and then the Baltic and Barents Sea, and the last two freeze half the year. And this geography still affects Russia's geopolitical strategy to this day, and its invasion of Crimea, and now that NATO has expanded and controls all the checkpoints for trade, that security of a buffer zone is now gone. But let's get back to post-World War II Stalin USSR. Now that the relations between West and East have been tarnished, the US and the USSR started getting into an arms race, making world tension run to an all-time high. And the Cold War wouldn't be a Cold War without proxy wars. And the Cold War didn't only contain Europe, it was global. But before that, Stalin would die. And the USSR had a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, and he did something shocking. Nikita Khrushchev made the USSR go on a path of de-Stalinization, taking down statues of Stalin and changing names of cities like Stalingrad to Volgograd, and Stalinabad back to Dushanbe. And Nikita Khrushchev wanted the Soviet populace to be more happy, but not in the way you'd expect. He typically sees freedom of expression in his own taste. But back to geopolitics. The capitalist West was doing way better than the communist East, with Berlin still being open and people deciding to stay there instead of coming back to the East. And at this time, the space race began with the Soviets sending their first satellites to space. And at this time, the amount of proxy wars shot up to the roof. At this time, from 3 to about 25 in 3 decades. With them happening all around the world. Like in Korea, check out my video on that by the way, shameless plug. In Vietnam, where the communist Viet Cong kicked out the Americans out of the country in a shameful defeat for the US. And also funding communist guerrilla groups all over the world, including Cuba, where the USSR and the USA had a little crisis. No, silly, not the type of crisis of you sitting in your mother's basement and not having a wife, kids, or a job. No, this was a nuclear crisis, where it almost led to world destruction. The USSR stationed their missiles in Castro-led Cuba, and the USA stationed their missiles in Turkey, until they pulled out their missiles out of their ally nations, and crisis averted. But many of these proxy conflicts were in Africa, over natural resources, cause you can't keep exploiting a continent if it's in constant chaos. And this brings us to Somalia in the 70s was a communist country with a strong sense of nationalism. Siad Barre ruled with an iron fist and did all the jolly dictatorship stuff, like having a cult of personality, harshly imposing the ideology of scientific socialism, also nationalizing resources, yada yada yada, and all that cool autocratic stuff. But one positive thing he did was increase literacy in Somalia. Before the military coup, Somalia had quite a large problem with education, with problems like what language to use, which system of the two Somalias they should use. So most parents in Somalia opted to send their children to Quran schools. Now, with Siad Barre, he was aiming to destroy the clan division of the country. This is foreshadowing. He launched rural education campaigns and literacy rose from a single digit 5% to a double digit 55% in just a decade. Those numbers would probably make it the fastest rise of literacy in history. But enough about the education part. Remember earlier in the video where I mentioned proxy conflicts? And the Cold War wouldn't be a Cold War without
proxy wars.
Well, the Cold War brought itself to the Horn of Africa, having beef between Ethiopia and Somalia. So, a bit of context. And what I mean by context is colonial borders being horrible. This line splitting ethnic Somalis from Somalia, with them being distributed from southern Djibouti to northern Kenya, and majority of these Somalis lied in the Ethiopian region of Ogaden. And Siad Barre wished of a greater Somalia, compromising all of the ethnic Somali regions, so as any good dictator wanting more power, he will fulfill these ambitions. But remember, it was a proxy war, so the two superpowers of the world intervened into the conflict, with the US supporting Ethiopia and the USSR supporting Somalia, both sending military equipment. But there's a plot twist, and it's Ethiopia, which was communist. Huh? Well, to understand how the war would follow, the Derg in 1974 would overthrow Haile Selassie I, the Emperor of Ethiopia, ending 5 centuries of monarchist rule in Ethiopia. And 3 years later, Siad Barre would launch an invasion into Ethiopia on the 13th of July 1977. At the start of the war, Somalia had a massive military advantage in terms of equipment, but not in manpower and geography. But Somalia still steamrolled the Ogaden region and were about 70% of their war goal at the peak of their military campaign, and almost reaching Dire Dawa, the largest settlement in the region, but also capturing Jijiga. Though you might be asking, how did Ethiopia, with a larger population, better terrain and air force, be losing? Siad Barre must have been asking for a humiliating loss, right? Well, kinda. Ethiopia recently before had multiple politically motivated purges in its military, which made Ethiopia have a significant military disadvantage at the start of the war. Also with the fact that Ethiopia is a multi-ethnic nation, with each ethnicity having their own interests, which is still visible to this day. But onto the war, Ethiopia was losing, until the Soviets betrayed Somalia to support Ethiopia, and Cuba sent troops to Ethiopia too. And confusingly, the two superpowers switched sides. But eventually Ethiopia got the upper hand, pushing Siad Barre's forces back to the border. And one thing about being a dictator and starting a war, do not lose. Seriously, don't lose. And you'll see why. After Somalia was pushed back and effectively lost the war, it cut all ties with the second world except for Romania and China. At the end of the war, many ethnic Somalis from Ethiopia fled to Somalia to be with their brethren, and about 1.3 million refugees fled, making Somalia's population increase by 24%. And for any country, that would be catastrophic, with most of these refugees fleeing to Sauk lands. Now that Somalia is starting to get unrestful, let's look back at the USSR. They looked at the USA going into Vietnam like a chicken without its head, and decided that they should also have their own Vietnam, and went to Afghanistan to support a communist government. But this also started putting Soviet coffers dry, since they were putting $128 billion into the Red Army in 1989, and to consider that Afghanistan was just an arid Vietnam, but colder, with Mujahideen fighters hiding in mountains. Supported by the USA, it won't really end up well for the Soviets in the long run. But why did the USSR collapse? It wasn't the loss in Afghanistan, it was the intimidation and image tarnished to the non-Russian Soviet republics. The Red Army looked weak, and then a couple weeks after the Soviet retreat from Afghanistan, in February 1989, Lithuania's democratic movement, and the final nail in the coffin was when USSR granted Poland to hold free and fair elections. And Poland left the Warsaw Pact, and the rest of Eastern Europe would follow, and at home there would be many domestic demonstrations, and the Soviet government were unable to stop it by force, and it caused a feedback loop in the Soviet government, causing it to become more fragmented and divided. And the USSR collapsed, starting with Lithuania on March 11, 1991, and followed by the rest of the Baltic sisters, Georgia, and a couple months later, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and then one after another, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and finally Kazakhstan, with the USSR dissolving on Christmas Day of 1991. But back to Somalia, Ogaden War, refugee crisis, and they were settling in the lands of the Sauk clan of northern Somalia, which showed great protest. Meanwhile, Siad Barre kept solidifying his grip on power, which made the north feel neglected, and the SNM and his Sauk-led movement started to revolt against Siad Barre. With his regime unable to beat the SNM in one-to-one combat, they started using the air force and artillery against them and started bombing their own civilians. And in addition to Siad Barre signing a peace treaty with Ethiopia, many Somali militias rose up in the thought of Siad Barre betraying the Somali people. Tons of them rose up, and Siad Barre's control started to crumble, and only had a strong sense of control in Mogadishu, and he gained the name the Mayor of Mogadishu. He declared a state of emergency, put family members to places in the military, and at the brink of his collapse, he fled to Kenya and then died in Nigeria. Meanwhile, Somalia was in total pure chaos. From 1991, Somalia didn't have an effective government at all, and Somalia plunged into a civil war, giving way to illegal fishing and to the emergence of piracy off the coast of Somalia, damaging global trade routes with hijacking and damage of goods. The Americans tried to intervene in Somalia, but they were pushed back by a Somali militia and Somalia was left to its own devices. Until it got a federal government in 2012, and 4 years before that, Al-Shabaab rose up and became the main Islamist group in East Africa, being weakened by Amazon forces and is now somewhat bouncing back. But now the Isaac majority have split off from Somalia and created their own country, Somaliland. And with tensions heating up in the region, with Ethiopia and Somaliland signing a deal for Ethiopia to get a port in exchange for recognition and slice of the Ethiopian state-owned airline. Meanwhile in Europe, Russia became a democracy, which is questionable and the future we can only tell. This video is getting too long, so